The first time my mother said it out loud, she didn't raise her voice. She leaned forward in her seat, just enough for the microphone to catch it, and said, "Those properties belong to us." My brother didn't even look at me. He just smiled, the kind of quiet, practiced smile that comes from years of winning rooms like this. "She was never meant to manage them," he added almost casually. "This is just a correction." I was sitting 3 feet away, 3 feet from the table, where my entire life was being rewritten in language that sounded clean and reasonable. 3 feet from the woman who raised me, and the man I grew up calling my partner in everything that mattered. Across from us, the judge didn't react right away. He simply nodded once and reached for the folder my attorney had placed on the clerk's desk moments earlier. I remember thinking, this is it. Not in a dramatic way. Not like something was about to explode. Just a quiet, steady realization that whatever happened next would decide whether I walked out of that room with anything left of what my aunt had built or nothing at all. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I believed I understood how my family worked. We don't yell. We don't break things. We don't make scenes in public. We just move decisions behind closed doors and present them as facts when it's too late to question them. The courtroom in Aspen was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, muted lighting, the kind of place designed to make everything feel controlled even when it isn't. There were only a handful of people in the gallery, 2 local business reporters, a couple I didn't recognize, and a clerk who hadn't looked up from her notes since we sat down. My attorney, David Klein, stood beside me. He had flown in from Chicago the night before, briefcase still creased from Travel Eyes alert, in a way that made me feel like I wasn't completely alone. But even he couldn't change what had already been said. My mother, Diane Carter, sat perfectly composed in her navy suit, hands folded in her lap, like she was attending a charity board meeting instead of a hearing that would decide ownership of an entire resort network. To her right was my brother, Mark Carter, founder of Carter Ridge Capital, the investment fund that had very efficiently absorbed nearly every asset our Aunt Margaret left behind. The hearing was supposed to be procedural. That's what I'd been told. A formal review of asset transfers. A confirmation of control. Paperwork, not conflict. But nothing about the past 2 weeks had felt procedural. Margaret Carter, my aunt, the woman who built those resorts from the ground up, had died suddenly at the end of the quarter. No long illness, no drawn-out transition. Just a phone call, and then a series of documents that appeared faster than grief could catch up. By the time I understood what I was reading, the ownership structure had already shifted. Quietly, legally, irreversibly. At least, that's how it was presented. "Your Honor," David said now, steady and precise, "we're requesting a review of the transfer under conditions that may indicate misrepresentation and undue pressure." Mark exhaled softly, like he'd heard this argument before and already dismissed it. Diane didn't even look at me. "She's emotional," she said, turning her attention back to the bench. "Emily has always taken things personally. This isn't personal. This is management." Management. The word landed with a kind of weight that didn't show on the surface, but settled somewhere deeper. Like what I had been part of, what I thought I had earned, was never real to begin with. Just something temporary, something tolerated. The judge finally opened the folder. It wasn't large. A standard set of documents, tabbed and organized, nothing about it dramatic or unusual from the outside. But the moment he started reading, something shifted. He didn't flip through quickly. He didn't ask a question. He just stopped, completely still, the way people do when they reach a line they weren't expecting to see. Mark's smile held for half a second too long. My mother's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. And for the first time since the hearing began, the room didn't feel controlled anymore. The judge turned one page, then another, slower this time. I didn't know exactly what he was seeing yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was in that folder, my family hadn't planned for it. And for the first time since they told me I had nothing, the outcome no longer felt certain. If you had met my family before all of this, you would have said we were the kind of people who had everything handled. Not loud, not chaotic, just polished. My mother built her life around that word without ever saying it out loud. Diane Carter didn't believe in appearances as decoration. She believed they were structure. The right clothes, the right tone, the right kind of silence, at the right time. It wasn't about pretending. It was about control. My brother learned that early. Mark Carter is 2 years older than me, and from the outside, he looks exactly like what people expect when they hear founder. Confident without being aggressive, measured, calm, the kind of man who can sit across from investors and make risk sound like opportunity. When he launched Carter Ridge Capital, my mother didn't just support him. She organized him. Introductions, positioning, connections. She moved pieces around him, like she was setting a table she intended to impress. I didn't resent that, at least not in the way people expect. I built something, too, just not in the same rooms. I run a financial compliance firm out of Denver. Small, focused, and intentionally quiet. My clients don't want attention. They want to know their numbers will hold up if anyone ever looks too closely. It's not glamorous work, but it's clean, predictable in a way that makes sense to me. And for a long time, that difference felt balanced. Mark handled growth. I handled risk. My mother handled perception. It worked because we didn't overlap. The only place our lives truly intersected was Margaret. Margaret Carter was my aunt, my father's older sister, and the only person in the family who never seemed interested in performing for anyone. She didn't talk about success like it was something you displayed. She treated it like something you maintained. The resorts were hers, not inherited, not gifted, built. She started with a single property, just outside Aspen, an aging lodge that most people would have torn down and replaced. Instead, she restored it, slowly, carefully. She kept the bones of it intact and rebuilt everything else around what mattered. Over time, that one lodge became a network. Different locations, same philosophy. Quiet luxury, real land, no shortcuts. When I was younger, she used to walk me through the properties before the guests arrived. People think this is about comfort, she told me once, standing in a half-finished room with the windows open to the mountains. It's about trust. They're paying to feel safe in a place they don't control. That stayed with me, probably more than anything my mother ever said. Margaret never made a show of favoring either of us, but she paid attention. And attention in a family like mine was its own kind of currency. Mark visited when it mattered: openings, investor dinners, anything that required visibility. I visited when things were quiet: inventory checks, off-season maintenance, the kind of work that didn't get photographed. Neither of us questioned it, because nothing felt like it needed to be questioned. When Margaret passed, it didn't happen with warning. No long decline, no slow transition that gave everyone time to prepare and align expectations. Just a call, a pause, and then a silence that spread faster than anyone could fill it. I remember standing in my office when I got the news, my hand still resting on a spreadsheet I'd been reviewing. Numbers on a screen that suddenly didn't matter. I flew to Aspen that night. By the time I arrived, everything already felt arranged. Not wrong, just ahead of me. My mother was composed. Mark was focused. Conversations were short, efficient. Words like structure, continuity, and management started appearing before grief had even settled into something recognizable. At the time, I told myself, that's just how we function. We don't fall apart. We organize. Looking back, that was the first moment something shifted. Not enough to name it. Just enough to feel like I was arriving slightly too late to something I was supposed to be part of. And for the first time, I had the quiet, uncomfortable thought that maybe the decisions being made weren't waiting for me at all. The first time something didn't line up, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, technical, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. I was sitting at the long dining table in Margaret's Aspen house, 3 days after the funeral arrangements if you could call them that, had been finalized. The house was too still. No guests, no extended family, no lingering condolences, just paperwork, stacks of it. Mark had arranged everything neatly, as if organization itself could make the situation feel legitimate. Folders labeled by property, by entity, by timeline. Efficient, clean, controlled. That word again. Just so we're aligned, he said, sliding a document toward me. The transition has already been executed. We're just walking through it for clarity. Walking through it like I had been part of the decision. I picked up the first document, a trust amendment, dated 6 weeks before Margaret died. I frowned, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Why wasn't I included in this discussion? I asked, keeping my voice even. My mother didn't answer right away. She was standing by the window, looking out toward the snow-covered trees, like the conversation wasn't entirely her responsibility. It was handled quickly, she said finally. Margaret wanted things streamlined. Streamlined. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, watching me the way he used to when we were kids, and I was trying to solve something he already understood. It's not about exclusion, Emily, he said. It's about efficiency. These properties need centralized management. That's what the fund provides. The fund, Carter Ridge Capital. I turned the page. The language was precise, legal, structured in a way that made it difficult to challenge without looking unreasonable. Ownership interests reallocated. Control consolidated under a single managing entity, Mark's entity. On paper it made sense, but something about the timing didn't. I flipped back to the date. 6 weeks. Margaret hadn't mentioned anything to me. Not a conversation, not a hint. And she wasn't the kind of person who made structural decisions quietly, especially not ones that affected something she had built from the ground up. When did she sign this? I asked. Mark didn't hesitate. Early December. I nodded slowly, letting the answer settle. I remembered December. I had been in Aspen twice that month. Once for an inventory review, once for a systems audit. Margaret asked me to look over. We had dinner both times. Talked about staffing, about winter bookings, about a supplier issue in one of the properties. Not once did she mention restructuring ownership. Not once. I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I kept reading. The next document was a transfer agreement. It detailed how the assets, each individual property, were being moved into a holding structure tied to the fund. The language referenced valuation metrics and future capital injections. It read less like a legacy plan and more like a transaction. Why route it through the fund? I asked, still looking at the page. Mark smiled patient. Because it's the most scalable option. We can leverage the assets, bring in outside capital, expand. Expand. The word didn't belong to Margaret. She built slowly, deliberately. She didn't leverage for growth. She protected what she had. I traced a line of text with my finger. There it was. A clause referencing projected valuations that didn't match what I had seen in our internal numbers just a few weeks earlier. Not wildly off, but not aligned either. Who prepared these projections? I asked. Our team, Mark said, with external advisors. Of course. I nodded again, this time more to myself than to them. From the outside, nothing here was obviously wrong. Everything had a structure, a justification, a professional explanation. But underneath that, there was a shift, subtle but real. From stewardship to control, from preservation to expansion, from Margaret's philosophy to Mark's. My mother finally turned from the window and looked at me directly. You're overthinking this, she said. Your aunt trusted your brother to take this to the next level. That's all this is. That's all this is. I closed the folder gently and set it back on the table. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just a difference in approach. But as I sat there, looking at the documents laid out in perfect order, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened without me being fully present for it. Not hidden, just positioned. And for the first time, the question wasn't just what had changed. It was why it had been changed so quietly. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It built quietly, the way a room changes when the air starts to thin Nothing obvious at first, just a slow awareness that something is off. I drove back to Denver 2 days after reviewing the documents in Aspen. The mountains faded behind me, in the rearview mirror, sharp and certain, replaced by long stretches of highway that felt too open, too exposed. By the time I reached my office, the structure I relied on, my work, my routines, my numbers, was the only thing that still felt steady. So I went back to what I understood. I opened the files Mark had given me and started again, this time, without conversation, without explanation, just the data. At first glance, everything was consistent. The transfer agreements matched the trust amendment. The entity structure aligned with the fund. The legal language was clean, deliberate, and difficult to challenge without sounding like you didn't understand how these things worked. But I wasn't reading for structure. I was reading for pattern. By the second hour, I stopped thinking about ownership and started tracking flow. Money in, money out, valuations assigned, projections layered over reality. That's when the discomfort sharpened into something more specific. The valuation assumptions attached to the properties weren't just optimistic. They were positioned, anchored to figures that required future performance that hadn't happened yet. Not impossible, just premature. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the spreadsheet on my screen. If those numbers were being used to support external investment, they weren't just internal projections. They were representations, and representations carry consequences. I closed the file and reached for my phone. There are certain calls you don't make lightly, not because they're dramatic, but because once you make them, you're acknowledging that something has crossed a line you can't ignore. I scrolled through my contacts and paused on a name I hadn't needed in years. David Klein. We'd worked together once on a compliance issue involving a mid-sized firm trying to structure around disclosure requirements. He was based in Chicago, specialized in securities law, and had a reputation for seeing problems before they became headlines. I hesitated for a second. Then I called. He answered on the third ring. "Emily Carter," he said, voice steady, as if we'd spoken last week instead of years ago. "That usually means something interesting." "I'm not sure yet," I replied. "That's why I'm calling." I didn't give him everything. Not yet. Just the outline. A family-held asset. A rapid transfer into a fund. Valuations that felt forward-leaning. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the line. "Send me what you can," he said finally. "Not summaries, documents." That was it. No alarm, no conclusions. Just process. I spent the rest of the afternoon compiling what I had, clean copies, labeled, structured, in a way that would make sense to someone who hadn't lived inside the situation. As I worked, my phone buzzed twice. The first was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. The second was Mark. A text. "Let's not overcomplicate this." I stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone face down on the desk. Overcomplicate? The word settled into me in a way that didn't feel like advice. It felt like direction. By the time I hit send on the file transfer to David, the sky outside had already darkened. Denver in winter doesn't ease into night, it just closes. I sat there for a moment, hand still on the keyboard, feeling the shift. Not a decision. Not yet. But something had moved. The next morning, David called back. "Emily," he said, and this time there was something different in his tone. Not urgency, not alarm, focus. "These numbers," he continued, "they don't match the story they're telling." I didn't respond right away, because that was the first time someone else had said it out loud. Not as a feeling, not as a suspicion, as a fact that could be examined. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," he said carefully, "if this structure is being presented to outside parties, the way it reads here, someone is going to ask questions. Questions, the kind that don't stay inside a family." I looked back at the files on my screen, at the neat rows, the clean formatting, the logic that held together until it didn't. "Do you think it's a problem?" I asked. Another pause. "I think," David said, "it's something you shouldn't ignore." That was all. No accusations. No conclusions. Just a line drawn quiet but clear. I ended the call and sat in the silence of my office, the weight of it settling in slowly. For the first time, this didn't feel like a disagreement about management. It felt like something that could leave the boundaries of our family entirely. And once something crosses that line, it doesn't come back the same. By the end of that week, the documents had stopped feeling like paperwork. They felt like a pattern I couldn't unsee. I had cleared my calendar without announcing it, canceled 2 client meetings, pushed a compliance review to the following week, and told my assistant I needed uninterrupted time. There are moments in business where stepping away costs you something. This didn't feel like one of them. This felt like the cost of not looking would be higher. David and I worked through everything methodically. No assumptions, no shortcuts. Every file I had sent him, he broke down into parts. He didn't look at the story. First, he looked at the structure: dates, signatures, transfers, valuation reports, investor summaries. Each piece on its own was defensible. Together they started to lean. Not enough to collapse, but enough to shift. We scheduled a call late Thursday afternoon. Not rushed, not urgent, just deliberate. "I've mapped the flow," he said, his voice steady through the speaker. "And there are inconsistencies that aren't just timing issues." I didn't interrupt. "Walk me through it." He paused for a moment, the kind of pause that signals he's choosing precision over impact. "The asset transfers are clean on the surface," he continued, "but they're tied to projected valuations that were likely used to support external positioning." "Positioning for what?" I asked. "Capital," he said simply, "or at least the appearance of it." I stared at the stack of printed documents on my desk. The same clean pages, the same organized structure. Nothing about them looked reckless. That was the problem. "Is it illegal?" I asked. Another pause. "It depends on how it's represented," he replied. "Internally, you have flexibility. Externally, you don't." Externally, outside the family. Outside, the version of the story I had been given. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "There's more," he added. I felt something in my chest tighten, not sharply, but steadily. "What?" "There's a sequence here," he said. "The trust amendment, the transfer agreements, the valuation adjustments, they all happen within a narrow window." 6 weeks, I said. "Yes," he confirmed. "And within that window, the narrative changes." Narrative, not numbers. I didn't like that word. "In what way?" I asked. "The properties shift from being legacy assets to being leverageable assets," he said. "That's not just a management decision. That's a positioning decision." Positioning for investors, for exposure, for something beyond what Margaret had ever intended. I closed my eyes for a second, not to block anything out, but to hold everything still long enough to see it clearly. Margaret didn't build for leverage. She built for stability. She didn't optimize. She preserved. "So what are you saying?" I asked quietly. "I'm saying," David replied, "if this was presented to outside parties as established value, rather than projected value, someone is going to have a problem with it." Someone. Not me. Not my family. Something larger. I opened my eyes and looked back at the documents. At Margaret's name on the signature line. At the date. At the structure that had been built around her absence. "Could she have agreed to this?" I asked. David didn't answer right away. "I can't speak to intent," he said finally. "But I can tell you this. This isn't how these transitions usually happen, when the original owner is fully in control." Fully in control. The word settled in slowly. Not as an accusation. As a gap. A space where something could have happened, or not happened the way it should have. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it shifting from abstract to something more defined. For days, I had been moving through this like it was a difference in philosophy, a disagreement about growth versus preservation. Now it felt like something else, something that had structure, something that could be examined, something that didn't rely on how I felt about it. I looked at my phone on the desk. No new messages from my mother, no calls from Mark. That silence didn't feel accidental. It felt contained, like they were waiting, or assuming, or confident that whatever I was doing would stay exactly where it belonged, inside the family. I reached for the top document again, running my fingers lightly over the page. There's a moment in situations like this where the question stops being whether something is wrong and starts being whether you're willing to acknowledge it out loud. Not publicly, not yet, just to yourself. I didn't say anything. Not to David, not to anyone. But as I sat there, looking at the structure laid out in front of me, I understood something with a clarity that didn't feel emotional. It felt final. If I kept this inside the boundaries they had set, then I would be agreeing to it. And once you agree to something like that, even quietly, it doesn't stay quiet. It becomes the version of the truth everyone else builds on. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next, but I knew what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to pretend this was just management. I didn't make the decision in one dramatic moment. There was no slammed door, no speech to an empty room, no sudden clarity that felt cinematic or brave. It happened the way real decisions usually happen, quietly, with paperwork open on a desk and a line inside you that finally stops moving. David flew out to Denver the following Monday and met me in my office before 8. He arrived with a leather briefcase, a legal pad already marked up, and the kind of calm that made everything feel more serious, not less. We sat across from each other in the small conference room I used for client reviews. The glass walls looked out over a winter gray skyline, and the coffee between us went cold before either of us touched it. He didn't try to persuade me. That mattered. He laid out the options the way he always did, cleanly, without drama. We could preserve the records, continue reviewing, wait to see how the asset structure was presented externally. Or we could act now. File for injunctive relief. Submit supporting documentation. Create a record before the transfer settled so deeply into place that undoing it would take years. If you move forward, he said, you need to assume this stops being private. I nodded. I know. No, he said gently. You know it becomes legal. That's not the same thing. I understood what he meant. Private family. Cruelty has a way of hiding inside tone, timing, omission. Once it becomes legal, it hardens. Names go on paper. Dates matter. Explanations stop being emotional and start being testable. And once you do that, you don't get to step back and call it a misunderstanding. David slid a draft filing toward me. Petition language, preservation requests, a clean argument built around timing valuation and the risk of irreparable transfer. Not revenge, not even accusation, not yet. Just a refusal to let the structure close over me while I stood there, pretending I still had time. My phone buzzed face down on the table. I looked at the screen. Mark. I let it ring out. A minute later, another call. My mother. David said nothing. He didn't need to. The room already understood what the timing meant. Then a text came through from Diane. You are making this uglier than it needs to be. Margaret wanted peace. Don't do this to the family. I stared at the words longer than I should have. That had always been the method. Reframe the harm as my reaction to it. Turn compliance into cruelty. Turn silence into maturity. I set the phone aside. David waited. This is the part, he said finally, where you decide whether keeping the peace is more important than keeping the truth intact. The sentence didn't hit me like wisdom. It hit me like recognition. I thought about Margaret restoring that first lodge instead of tearing it down. about how carefully she built things that were meant to last, about the way my mother used words like management and transition, as if language itself could bleach out motive. And I realized something I should have understood earlier. If I signed nothing, said nothing, filed nothing, if I stayed quiet, because speaking would make them angry, I would still be making a choice, just not one that belonged to me. I picked up the pen, not quickly, not for effect, just steadily. My name looked strange for a second on the signature line, as if it belonged to someone with less to lose. Then the feeling passed. David gathered the papers without comment, but his posture changed, slightly. The way people change when a plan stops being hypothetical. Before he left, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mark in a voicemail. "Emily," he said, his voice controlled, almost tired. "You're being emotional, and you're letting outside people turn this into something it isn't. Don't force a public problem where there doesn't need to be one." I listened to it once, then deleted it. By noon, the filings were in motion. Nothing had been decided yet. No hearing, no order, no public collapse. But something irreversible had happened all the same. I had stopped protecting the version of the story they needed me to protect. And once you do that, the silence between people doesn't feel the same anymore. It starts to sound like the space before impact. The first sign that it was no longer contained didn't come from my family. It came from a notification. I was in my office early Tuesday morning, halfway through reviewing a client report I hadn't fully processed, when my email refreshed and flagged a subject line I hadn't seen before. Court order, temporary injunction filed. I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I understood what it meant. The filing had been accepted, not decided, not ruled on, but acknowledged. And once something is acknowledged inside a system like that, it stops being theoretical. I read the order twice, then a third time. The language was precise, limited in scope, but enough to halt further transfers tied to the properties in question until review. Not a victory, not even close, but not nothing. I sat back in my chair, the room unusually quiet, and let that settle. This was the moment where it stopped being just my version of events against theirs. Now there was a record. By mid-morning, the silence broke. My phone rang once, then again. Then it didn't stop. The first call I answered was from a number I didn't recognize. "Emily Carter," a man's voice asked. "Yes, this is Daniel Ruiz. I'm with one of the investment groups listed in Carter Ridge Capital's recent disclosures." Investment groups. External. "I was hoping you could clarify something," he continued. "We've been notified of a temporary hold tied to certain assets. Is there an issue with the underlying valuations?" The question was careful, professional, but underneath it, there was something else. Concern. "I can't speak on ongoing legal matters," I said evenly. A pause. "I understand," he replied, "but I'd recommend you prepare for further inquiries. This is already raising flags." Raising flags. The phrase lingered after the call ended, because that was the part no one had said out loud before. This wasn't just internal anymore. It was visible. I didn't have time to sit with it. A message from David came through seconds later. "We need to talk, now." He called before I could respond. "They've seen it," he said without preamble. "Who has?" "Not everyone," he replied, "but enough." The injunction triggered notifications tied to their disclosures. Investors, auditors, anyone watching closely. I stood up without realizing it, pacing once across the office before stopping again. "So this spreads," I said. "Yes," David confirmed. "And it won't spread evenly." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "your brother is going to move to contain it." Contain. The word didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt immediate, as if the structure I had interrupted was now shifting in response. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark. Not a call. A message. "We need to talk. Today." No tone, no explanation, just direction. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked back at the injunction order, still open on my screen, at the language that had seemed so controlled an hour ago, and realized something had changed. Not in the document, in the context around it. By early afternoon, the response came. Not publicly, not through filings, through pressure. My assistant knocked lightly on the conference room door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He didn't have an appointment." "Who?" She hesitated. "He said his name is Thomas Green. He's with Carter Ridge." I felt my chest tighten, not sharply, but enough to register. I didn't know him personally, but I knew the name. Senior operations, close to Mark, the kind of person who handled problems quietly. "I'll take it here," I said. When he walked in, he didn't sit right away. He looked around the room first, taking in the space, the walls, the distance. Then he gave a small, polite nod. "Emily," he said, "I'm here to make sure this doesn't go further than it needs to." There was no threat in his voice. That was what made it clear. "This is already further than it needed to go," I replied. He smiled slightly, as if acknowledging the point without accepting it. "Things escalate when they're misunderstood," he said. "We're hoping to avoid that." Misunderstood. Another familiar word. I said nothing. He stepped closer to the table, placing a single folder down in front of me. "Your brother believes this can still be resolved privately," he continued, "before unnecessary attention complicates matters for everyone involved." Everyone involved. Not just them, not just me, the investors, the firms, anyone tied to the structure. I looked at the folder but didn't open it. "Is that a request?" I asked. "It's an opportunity," he said. The room felt smaller than it had that morning. Not physically, but in the way pressure reduces space until you can feel it in your breathing. For the first time since filing, I felt the shape of the risk clearly. Not just legal, personal, professional, reputational. Everything I had built sitting in the path of something much larger than a family dispute. Thomas straightened, sensing he had said enough. "We'd prefer not to make this public," he added, "for your sake as much as ours." Then he turned and left, without waiting for a response. The door closed softly behind him. I stood there for a moment, looking at the folder on the table, at the weight of it, at what it represented. Not resolution, control, a way back into the version of the story they needed. I didn't open it, not yet, but as I stood in the quiet room, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about proving what had happened. It was about whether I could withstand what would happen next, because whatever came after this wasn't going to stay contained. I didn't open Thomas Green's folder until after he left, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I wanted the room to belong to me again before I let their version of things back into it. When I finally did, the contents were exactly what I should have expected. No threats, no ugly language, just a private settlement proposal wrapped in civility, a restructuring path, a discretionary payout, confidentiality language so polished it almost looked generous. Almost. It wasn't an offer to fix anything. It was an offer to narrow the story before anyone else could read it. That was the first mistake I realized I'd made. I had been looking at the problem as if the documents alone would move the system. But documents don't speak for themselves. People frame them. Timing frames them. Silence frames them too. By Wednesday evening, I understood the next phase wasn't just about proving the structure was wrong. It was about preventing Mark from defining the structure before the court ever looked closely at it. David came in by video that night from his hotel room in Aspen. Jacket off tie, loosened the legal pads behind him, spread across the desk in small, precise stacks. "They're going to argue this is a family dispute, dressed up as a securities issue," he said. "They already are," I replied. "Yes," he said, "which means we stop answering the emotional version of it." I leaned back in my chair and looked again at the settlement proposal Thomas had left behind. It was careful in the way only expensive damage control can be careful. Every sentence tried to turn loss into misunderstanding. Every paragraph assumed I still wanted a way back in. "I don't," I said quietly. David didn't ask what I meant. He knew. "Then we tighten the frame," he said. "No broad claims, no speeches. We keep it to timing, representations, and risk. Let them sound personal. We stay structural." That was the second shift. Up to that point, I had still been moving inside the emotional gravity of the family, the old instinct to explain myself. to make them understand, to prove I wasn't being cruel by refusing to cooperate. But court wasn't built for family language. It was built for sequence. What happened? When? Under what authority? With what consequence? I spent the next morning in my office pulling together a chronology clean enough to stand on its own. Margaret's death, the trust amendment, the transfer documents, the valuation assumptions, the disclosures tied to Carter Ridge. I wasn't searching for outrage anymore. I was building a line no one could blur without leaving fingerprints. By noon, David sent over the hearing outline. Not dramatic, not long, just disciplined. Mark's side would push competence, continuity, centralized management. They would make me sound sentimental, destabilizing, resistant to scale. It was obvious now. They didn't need to destroy me. They just needed to reduce me to a type. The grieving niece, the emotional holdout, the woman confusing inheritance with belonging. And for the first time, that didn't rattle me the way it would have a week earlier, because the hearing wasn't where I needed to win the family argument. It was where I needed to keep the record open long enough for the right people to see what was already inside it. Friday morning in Aspen came gray and flat, the kind of winter light that makes every surface look colder than it is. The courtroom felt smaller than it had the first time, tighter, more intentional. My mother was already there when I walked in, seated straight-backed, in a charcoal suit, hands folded, like composure itself had chosen a body. Mark sat beside his attorney, calm, prepared, almost bored. That confidence told me something useful. He still believed framing would save him. David placed our file on the table between us and lowered his voice. Today, he said, we don't chase them. We make them stand next to their own structure. I looked across the room at my family and felt something settle into place. Not peace, not forgiveness, control. For the first time since Margaret died, I wasn't walking into a room hoping to be included in the truth. I was walking in, prepared to hold the line until they exposed themselves against it. And when the clerk called the matter to order, I understood exactly what this hearing was. Not the end, just the moment the system finally started listening. The moment itself was quieter than I expected. No one gasped. No one stood up. No one said the kind of lines people imagine happen when a room finally understands it has been lied to. It happened in paper sounds. A page turning. A pause that lasted too long. The low, careful tone judges use when they stop speaking to the room and start speaking to the record. Mark's attorney had just finished doing exactly what David said he would do. He framed the whole thing as an overreaction, a private disagreement over management made messier by grief and timing. He used words like continuity, stewardship, efficiency. He made everything sound orderly, mature, necessary. Then David stood. He didn't argue with the story. He narrowed it. He took the court back through the timeline, one document at a time. Margaret's death, the amendment window, the transfer structure, the valuation language used to support the holdings inside Carter Ridge. Nothing dramatic, just sequence. What happened? When? Under whose control? With what assumptions attached? By the time he submitted the supplemental file, the room had shifted in that subtle way rooms do when people stop deciding what they believe and start waiting to be told what the evidence permits. The judge reached for the file. I knew what was inside. I had seen every page, every supporting note, every disclosure that didn't quite align with the structure Mark wanted the court to accept. But knowing something privately and watching it enter a formal record are not the same thing. The judge opened it and read in silence. Mark remained still at first. That same confident posture, hands folded, eyes forward. My mother sat beside him, her expression fixed into the careful concern she always wore when she wanted to look both gracious and wounded at the same time. Then the judge turned a page, and another. He stopped, lifted one document slightly, and looked over it again. Mark's attorney shifted beside him. Not much, just enough to register. The judge set the paper down and spoke without raising his voice. These valuation representations, he said, Were they provided to outside parties in substantially this form? No one answered immediately. That was the first real crack. Mark's lawyer stepped in, trying for control. Your Honor, these are preliminary internal. The judge cut him off with a look sharp enough to flatten the rest of the sentence. That was not my question. Silence pressed down over the room. Mark spoke then, for the first time that morning, without sounding prepared. They were part of ongoing discussions, he said. Nothing was finalized. Discussions. It was the same instinct I had watched my family use my whole life. Reduce, reframe, soften the edges until the structure sounds harmless. The judge turned to another section of the file. And these disclosures tied to Carter Ridge Capital, he said. Why do they describe stabilized asset assumptions not yet supported by operating history? This time, Mark didn't answer quickly enough. His attorney did, but too fast, too polished. Exactly the wrong speed for a question that required truth before strategy. I watched the change happen in real time. Not collapse, recognition. The judge was no longer evaluating a grieving family dispute. He was evaluating whether the court had been asked to bless a structure built on representations that carried consequences beyond inheritance. That was the moment the room changed sides, not emotionally, institutionally. The judge leaned back, closed the file, and looked directly at David. Counsel, he said, I want the record preserved in full. The temporary injunction remains in place. No transfers, no encumbrances, no changes to the operating entities pending further review. My breath didn't leave me in relief. It sharpened, because this wasn't the end. It was worse for them than an ending. It was a stop, a public documented stop. Mark's composure broke in the smallest possible way. His jaw tightened. One hand moved to the table and flattened there like he needed to feel something solid under it. My mother turned toward him, then toward the bench, then back again, as if one of those angles might still contain an exit. There wasn't one. The judge continued, still calm. I am also directing that the materials related to external valuation and disclosure representations be transmitted to the appropriate reviewing authorities. No one in the courtroom needed that phrase translated. Appropriate reviewing authorities. It landed exactly where it was meant to. My mother finally looked at me then. Not with anger, not first, with disbelief, as if the real betrayal in her mind was not what they had done. It was that I had allowed the system to see it. When the hearing adjourned, no one rushed toward me. No apologies, no private appeals. The people at Mark's table were suddenly too busy, conferring in tight, urgent voices. David gathered our files slowly, carefully, like a man packing instruments after surgery. Outside the courtroom, the winter air hit cold and clean. Aspen looked the same. Snow at the curb, gray sky. Quiet storefronts beginning their afternoon. But inside the structure that had carried my family this far, something had finally given way. Not all at once, just enough. Enough for the consequences to start moving without me having to push them. And for the first time since Margaret died, Mark was no longer managing the narrative. He was trapped inside the record. The outcome didn't arrive with noise. It came in documents. Weeks passed after the hearing, not with silence, but with a different kind of movement. Formal, measured, the kind that doesn't ask for attention because it doesn't need it. The injunction held, then expanded. Requests turned into reviews. Reviews turned into formal inquiries. The same systems Mark had tried to use for leverage now required clarity from him in return. Every valuation, every disclosure, every assumption that had once lived comfortably inside presentation decks now had to stand on its own. And some of them didn't. Carter Ridge didn't collapse overnight. That's not how things like that fall apart. It tightened first. Access restricted. Transfers paused. Communications filtered. Investors who had once leaned forward with interest began leaning back with caution. Not loudly, not publicly. Just enough. Enough to slow everything down. Enough to change the tone. Mark stopped calling. Not suddenly. Just gradually. The messages spaced out, then disappeared. My mother tried once more. She came to Denver without warning, standing outside my office in a coat that looked more like armor than clothing. For a moment, I saw the version of her I had spent most of my life responding to the one who could turn any room into something she controlled. But something had shifted, not in her, in me. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice softer than I expected. "We could have handled it differently." Differently. I let the word sit between us. "We did handle it differently," I replied. She looked at me, then really looked, as if trying to find the version of me that would still bend under the weight of that sentence. "This is going to follow your brother for the rest of his life," she said. I didn't answer immediately, because that was the first time she had said something true without reshaping it. "Yes," I said finally, "it will." There was no anger in it, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. She stood there a moment longer, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before turning and walking away. That was the last time I saw her. By early spring, the structure was no longer in question. The properties were separated from the fund's control under court supervision. Independent auditors were brought in. Governance was reestablished with safeguards that couldn't be rewritten in a 6-week window. Not dramatic, just permanent. David called me one afternoon as the final orders were being processed. "It's done," he said. I sat with that for a moment. Done didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a boundary that had finally been recognized. A line that couldn't be crossed quietly anymore. A few weeks later, I went back to Aspen. Not for a hearing, not for a meeting, just to stand on the property Margaret built. The snow was beginning to melt, leaving patches of earth, visible again, uneven and real. The lodge looked the same from the outside. It always would. That was the thing about places built with intention. They don't show the battles that happen around them. I walked through the main room, slowly running my hand along the wood Margaret had refused to replace years ago. It still carried the marks of time, still held. She had been right, not about everything, but about the part that mattered. You build things to last, not to impress. I stepped outside and looked out at the mountains, the air sharp and clean, in that way that doesn't comfort you. It just tells you the truth. For a long time, I had thought this was about taking something back, about correcting a wrong. But standing there, I understood it differently. This wasn't about reclaiming what they tried to take. It was about refusing to become the kind of person who lets something false stand, just because it's easier. The quiet after that realization didn't feel empty. It felt earned, not clean, but steady. And for the first time since Margaret died, I wasn't thinking about what had been done to me. I was thinking about what I had chosen not to carry forward. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping the truth, you already know it doesn't feel like strength in the moment, but it holds in ways nothing else does. If this story meant something to you, share what you think justice really looks like when it comes to family. And if you've ever had to stand your ground quietly, I'd like to hear that too. Don't forget to follow for more stories like this. There's always another one waiting.